What's up, guys? This is Tommy from the Ravens Creek Study, and we are continuing through Sources on Theology. This is Prolegomena. It's Systematic Theology 1. Here I have a Greek word. It is paradosis, in case you don't know Greek. Essentially, this is the word that is used in the New Testament for tradition. It's sometimes translated as handed down. Think of like in Acts 6:14. The accusation that Jesus came to destroy the temple and to change the customs that Moses handed down to us. 2 Thessalonians 3:6 is another place where we see the word come up, or at least a derivative of the word, that Paul is warning these Thessalonians to break away from the fellowship of those who are living astray and living according to and not living according to the traditions that you received from us, from Paul and his companions. Um, so we can see here, tradition has somewhat of a broad definition here. It is the Greek word to express the teaching that we've received, and sometimes it's also used to say to pass on teaching or stories to the next generation, such as in Deuteronomy. Here I've got an example. It comes up in Exodus and in Leviticus as well. I believe Leviticus as well. It comes up, I know for a fact, in Exodus that God commands to pass it on, the things that have happened here in Egypt, pass that on to the next generation. And later in Exodus, when you're practicing Passover together, that the elder son is supposed to ask a question that's going to cause for you to be able to reiterate the story so that you can pass it on to the next generation. And you have in Deuteronomy no less than 5 times does God command to pass on the teachings and the stories to the next generation. God is serious about this. He wants us, when we raise the next generation, whether they're our own children or whether they're just the kids that we know, He wants us to raise them in a way that they are aware and, maybe I should say, zealous. They have awareness and zeal of God, of and for God. And so when we're looking at tradition within the realm of systematic theology, within the realm of source for theology, there are essentially 3 ways in which people treat tradition. There's tradition 0. This is the claim that Scripture is the only thing worthy of our consideration, and nothing else has anything to say to us. Now, this is a rare statement. It's a rare view. But there are people who have this view. I can think of one name, Stephen Anderson. Now, it's ironic to me, excuse me, it's ironic to me to make the statement that Scripture is the only thing worthy of our consideration and that nothing else has anything to say to us, and then you expect people to listen to you. It's an ironic thing to say, but it exists nonetheless. There's tradition 1, which I'm not the one who came up with this 0, 1, and 2. I would have put 1, 2, and 3. But this tradition 1, we claim that tradition can be helpful in our study of Scripture, and anything that does not have historical background is highly suspect. What I mean by that, essentially, if you're reading the Bible and you come across a verse that it's perplexing to you, and so you try to think, well, what could this verse mean? There are 2 things that can happen. Either one, you can go back to like commentaries or books that you know from other authors who have addressed this kind of issue, and you can start reading what they have to say, and you can say, oh, I see what's going on here now. Right? So it can be helpful in our study of Scripture. It can aid us in understanding those things that we don't necessarily understand, right? But it can also be that if we read this verse or this passage that's somewhat foggy on what is it actually saying here, and we come to a conclusion, well, maybe what it means is this, and then we go back just in our own devotional time. It's not even something that we're probably going to do on purpose, but we're just, for whatever reason, reading through this or that, and we start to find, my view here, there's no backing whatsoever historically. I can't find anybody who has this view before me. Well, that's something that we should treat as highly suspect. If we cannot find anybody else who has said the same thing or similar things to what we believe, that's a good sign that we're not believing the correct thing. Now, it's possible, and in some cases I think it's true, that the correct statement has at various times throughout church history been skewed, blurred, or even denied, rejected. I think that we can find examples of that throughout church history, but that doesn't then mean that we are without warrant, because we still can look at other people. So, for example, the issue of baptism when you are saved. The issue of baptism when you're saved. We, as a people, as an evangelical church, as a Protestant church, and even Catholics today, there are some Catholics who do baptism after you've been born again. We as Protestants believe that we should be baptizing after you have been saved. But if you go back 500 years, it was not Calvin who invented that idea. It was not Luther who invented that idea. It was not Zwingli who came up with that idea. It was the Anabaptists who Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli were persecuting. The very people that the Protestants were saying, you are going way too far, you're way too radical. They are the ones who were now, at this time in modern history, practicing what they said and what they firmly stood on. That baptism is not for infants, it's for those who are born again. The issue that Luther and Calvin had is that if you're baptized in an infant, it does not then guarantee you're going to go to heaven. I mean, the infant baptism thing, there's a lot of debate here, but let's face it, when you go back before Luther and Calvin, you don't really find a whole lot of evidence of infant baptism being, quote, wrong. So, I mean, should we who believe that we should be baptized when we're born again, should we look at the first, 1,000 years or 1,500 years of church history and say, oh, well, I guess we're wrong? Well, no. Because there are people that we can go even before Luther and Calvin. There is a stream that we can follow where it does show evidence. And more than that, it also shows evidence in the scriptures. The whole point of baptism, when you read Romans chapter 6, the whole point of baptism is that you have died and were buried with Christ. Well, that doesn't happen when you're an infant. You see what I'm saying? So, I mean, it's not like we're without scriptural support here, but we can see how tradition can be very helpful. That if we don't see historical background here, it's highly suspect. But that's not the end all be all either. So, again, tradition being under the authority of Scripture. Tradition 2. This is the claim that tradition is on the same authority, the same par with Scripture. So, I guess I'm going to get into that in just a minute. I think it's this next slide. So tradition 2 is very Roman Catholic. That is the classic evil giant that the Protestants like to try to slay. This is, and I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but historically it's true. Protestantism hates the idea of tradition being on par with Scripture. It's very Roman Catholic, and it's ironic to me, it's also very Jewish. Now, in both of these cases, we do have groups, and probably a larger group than I know, because I'm not really in that much relationship with these people. We do see where it doesn't go to extremes, where if you read the Mishnah or the Talmud or the teaching of the rabbis and sages, there are Jews who are going to look at that and say, okay, the Scripture says this, and this is the way the rabbis interpret it. And you see the difference there between saying the rabbis have said, and just point out Rashi says, Maimonides says. There's a difference here. There are some who will say the Scripture says, and the rabbis interpreted this passage as. Or if they say the rabbis have told us, the Rebbe told us, Akiva told us, where even though they're not saying the Scripture says and the rabbi said, but they're saying Akiva said, they will say he got that from. I mean, I've read these books. I know it exists. There are people who don't go to the extreme. They see that the tradition, they hold it to a high standard, but they see that the tradition comes from the view, it comes from this in Scripture. Whereas the Roman Catholics, I don't have really any connection with Roman Catholicism, but the argument is often that the Roman Catholics will argue for things like purgatory by going to tradition. And when you say, well, where is that in Scripture? They'll go to something like Second Maccabees, and so you're left going, but that's not really Scripture. And so they'll continue to press the issue of the apocryphal material needs to be Scripture, and that it's in their Bible. Why is it not in our Bible? I mean, but do you see what I'm saying here? Like the tradition 2, there are those who go to the extreme, but there are those who are within that group of extremists, if you will, who are not that extreme. And I guess you can say that about really all of these. Tradition 0, this is a rare find. I think I already mentioned this. Stephen Anderson is a good example. And if you don't know who Stephen Anderson, I don't suggest Googling him because he's bitter. Maybe I'll just put it that way. He seems like a very bitter man. Tradition is the doctrine of man. Why would I follow that? This is kind of the mantra, that tradition is the doctrine of man. Well, no. Tradition is the wrestlings of men trying to understand who God is. It doesn't mean it's the doctrine of man. It means it's the wrestling of men, and they teach their doctrine, yes, but ultimately we're all men who are wrestling here. What is usually behind this belief of tradition 0, that tradition is absolutely, you should never go towards it, you should only read the Scripture. What's usually behind that belief is a misunderstanding of what tradition actually is. And oftentimes, this kind of view, this radical view, it comes from somebody who was hurt and embittered, and now they're going to an extreme. I guess this also happens within theology specifically, but this happens a lot. We see something we disagree with, and then we overreact by going to the opposite side. That happens a lot. Whether that's really what happens here with Tradition 0, I doubt it, but it does happen. Tradition 1, this is the most balanced view. And again, even within here, we have those who go one way or the other way on the issue. You have those who are more skeptical of tradition and some who are less skeptical of tradition. That, when they have their favorites, if I'm reading a Leonard Ravenhill book, I'm going to take this as like, this man was a prophet and he is going to tell me the oracles of God, or Tozer, or MacArthur, or fill in the blank, whoever our favorite authors are. When we pick up this book, we're going to say, man, this guy knew Jesus, and so I'm going to read this book as if this man has all of it that I need to know. Well, that's not necessarily the best way to read anything, to be honest, but you can see there are some people who take that kind of thing, and of course, if we're reading something that is against our own belief, we're going to read that with more skepticism, irregardless. But generally speaking, know where you sit on the map, and really what I want to point out here is with tradition, there is a way to be balanced. There is a way to view it as, I'm skeptical of what others are saying because it's not the Scripture, but I'm also using it as a tool to help me to understand. God is our primary focus, and if someone's teaching is stifling that, then it's not a theological source. It's the opposite of a theological source. It's taking us away from God, and that's not theology. So what I use tradition for, more than forming my own opinions, is to find other ways in which people have looked at it. So, for example, one of the things I love Karl Barth for, I don't really read Karl Barth to understand. I read Karl Barth to find better questions. He asks questions I haven't thought to ask. Same thing with Moltmann or A.W. Pink, or these are people who have studied these issues longer than I have, and oftentimes have better questions. And even if I don't agree with their answers, they have better questions. Sometimes I read things to come across arguments that I haven't considered, or I'll watch YouTube videos or whatever to come across arguments that I have not yet considered, whether it's for or against my position. Same thing with explaining difficult passages. If I'm reading in 2 Kings that Elisha comes back from the taking away of Elijah, and there are these kids who come out of the woodwork and they start making fun of Elisha by saying, "Hey, you bald head, yeah, bald head," and Elisha is offended and he curses them, and the next thing you know, a bear comes out of nowhere and starts eating and devouring these kids. Like, what in the world is happening here? That's one of those passages that I would look at some of the commentaries. How are others looking at this? How are others understanding this? If I find articles or something online or teachings online where people have gone through this as a sermon series or whatever, and they've come to this passage, how are they understanding this? What are they getting out of this? How can that help me to better understand what in the world's going on here? That's a weird passage of scripture, What do we? The last, and I shouldn't say last, the fourth way, and I'm sure there's more if I were to really think about it, but the fourth way I use tradition is trustworthy scholarship in areas that I'm not well versed. So, for example, I'm not a linguist. I know basic Hebrew and I know basic Greek. That doesn't mean that I can read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek and understand it. It doesn't mean that I'm at a place where I can translate it. As one professor had put it, your first year Greek, you learn all of this information and you think, man, I can really interpret the Bible now. Second year Greek, you learn you don't know anything and you need to shut up. Third year Greek, now you've got something to talk about. And usually people who are going to be scholars in the languages, they haven't taken 3 years of Hebrew, they haven't taken 3 years of Greek, they've taken 6, 7, 8 years. I mean, by that point, we're coming almost up to a decade worth of classes and courses on Hebrew and Greek before they can consider themselves a scholar on it. Same thing with ancient culture. Now, I know quite a bit more than I used to, but I mean, I've still got my books. I've got the Minhagim book. The Minhagim book is the book of customs. It's a Jewish book to explain the daily prayers, the daily rituals, the daily and not just daily, but weekly and monthly and yearly. So when you come to feasts, here's how we conduct the feast. Here's how we conduct the days before the feast. All of it. So this helps me to understand when I'm reading the New Testament and I see that Jesus goes to the feast, and it doesn't tell me which feast. Jesus went to the feast, and it starts explaining some of the things that are happening. I go, oh, well, that's obviously Tabernacles. Because during the week of Tabernacles, they're teaching on these things, and that's what Jesus is referencing. That's what they're responding with. That's obviously Tabernacles. It's specifically thinking of John chapter 7 and 8. Another thing, history. I'm not a huge history buff. My wife is, but I'm not a huge history buff. I don't know a whole lot of history. So some of the things that are happening take for example the time of the Exodus. Scholars debate as to when exactly that would have been. However, there's an interesting time in history where the whole economic structure of Egypt collapsed. And it was during the time of the it was during the time of the Hittites. Now, I didn't know this. I learned this from somebody else who is a historian. He's actually an archaeologist, but with archaeology, you have to know history. And he went through and he showed, okay, here's the time we see that Egypt is getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and then it kind of plateaus and starts to go down a little bit, but then right here, there's your economic collapse. There is the whole kingdom of Egypt people are throwing their gods to the side because of the collapse of their economy. People are forming new gods to replace the old ones because these gods obviously don't work. There was actually a letter sent from the queen to the Hittite enemy saying, send us one of your princes that I can marry so we at least have some ruler. That's probably the time of the Exodus. Church history. This kind of goes with history, but different, right? I'm not a huge scholar in church history either. I know some things, but I don't know. I'm not a scholar by any means. I'm not somebody who really knows church history. That's why I'm not offering it on this channel. Is I don't know history. So, but you can get from this list. You can understand kind of where I'm coming from. Tradition for me, it's a source, but it's not the source. And I use it I use it as a tool more than a source. I use it as a tool to wrestle things that I hadn't quite considered before. But anyway, let me know what you think. Where do you stand with tradition? Where do you think we should stand with tradition? What are the ways we can use tradition? How should it be a tool? Should it be a source? How would you define that? Let me know your thoughts. Comment below. Thanks for listening.